Good morning. Usually, that sounded like a teacher. Usually, Jeff Dunn is up here welcoming everyone to the symposium, but I am Jan DeVault, and this is the first time I've actually done the introductions, and believe me, I was up at 1:30 and saying to myself, how can I thank all of these wonderful people who helped prepare today, and also you all who are so wonderful for coming. This is our 10th Battle of San Jacinto Symposium, and there are a couple of housekeeping matters. You may have noticed you don't have strings to your name tags. You will. Our registrar, God bless Dave Britton and Dave Singleton, our registrar had another commitment. So at I'm not going to say at the last hour, but the last few hours, Dave Britton has been trying to pull lists and everything together. So we have to cut him a little slack. Dave Britton, Dave Singleton, the symposium committee have worked very hard to bring a special morning to you. You all should have received a packet, a white packet. In that packet is today's program, and there is also an evaluation sheet. And we're hoping that you will read your program. There is a lot of good information in there about our speakers, and also pay attention to the folks that are our sponsors, our donors, our patrons, because without them, we would not be able to do what we're doing today. There are some of you, and actually I'm just very curious, how many of you were here when we did the first San Jacinto Symposium? That is amazing. That is amazing. I know Jim Crisp and Jeff Dunn and I were here. You were there, Greg. In fact, Greg Dimmick, Jim Crisp, I think have been at every symposium, and my gosh, Greg Dimmick has pinch hitted as a speaker on at least one occasion for us, and we're very glad for that friendship and for the commitment that they have made. I'd like to, if I could, and I know I don't have very long, and you can do this to me like I do to Jeff Dunn when I start talking too much.
Push you off.
Please don't push me off. Don't push me off. To tell those of you, let me ask, how many of you, is this the first time you've been at the symposium? There's quite a few of you. Okay, thank you for coming. How this whole thing got started, it was a seed that Jeff Dunn planted 10 years ago. And Jeff at the time was the chairman of the San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board, and Nell Hoover and I made up the other three. There were three public members, and then Bill Connor was the representative for the San Jacinto Museum of History. And I went back and looked, and Jeff will remember this. Maybe not the date, but I'm going to tell you, Jeff, good historian that you are. June 17th, the year 2000. In the next item of business, this is from the San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board minutes, Chairman Dunn asked if any additional thought had been given to having a symposium or seminar on San Jacinto. And Bill Connor and I said, we have a friend at the University of Houston who actually is the Dean of the Honors College, and his name is Ted Estes. So Jeff suggested, and we all agreed that what we needed to do is actually meet with Ted and see if there's something that maybe we could put together. And we did. And Ted was very positive. He said, this is something definitely that I would encourage. I would encourage the university to get involved. And so that we reported back to the next advisory board meeting. And unfortunately, Nell Hoover, who was one of the public members, one of the three, died that summer. So it was just Jeff and I. And luckily, in the fall, Nina Hindi, many of you know Nina Hindi. Nina Hindi was appointed to fill the term of Nell Hoover, and she said she would take the responsibility of making sure that we got this symposium off the ground. And I will forever be grateful to Nina Hindi for many things, but for certainly sticking in there and doing this first symposium, and she did the first and the second symposium. And this is hard to believe, but our first symposium was actually, we had 4 speakers. We had Jim Crisp, we had Frank Thompson, we had Greg Dimmick, and Miguel Soto. Since that time, and I'm gonna take the time, don't do this, don't cut me off yet. I'm gonna take the time to tell you who we have had over the years, and it is quite an amazing list of people. We've had Jim Haley, Josefina Vasquez, Steve Harden, Gerard Kendall, Frank De La Teja, J.P. Bryan, Bruce Winders, Raul Ramos, Madge Roberts, Mike Campbell, Michael Strutt, Ted Hollingsworth, Greg Cantrell, Andres Tijerina, John Wheat, Jack Jackson, Bill and Marjorie Walraven, Ann Hodges, Brenda McClurkin, Carolina Krim, Ed Miller, Felix Alvarez, John Jordan, Jerry Drake, Archie McDonald, Andres Resendez, Paula Marks, David Pomeroy, Fred McGee, Steve Moore, Gary Clayton Anderson, Steve Harrigan, Michael Angel Quiroga, Stuart Reed, Betsy Davis, Brianna Belton, Bill Brands, Sam Hayes, Jim Bevel, Roger Moore, Manuel Hinojosa, and Douglas Mangum. These are some of the brightest minds, brightest historians, and insightful speakers that you could have. They have kept us thinking about San Jacinto for 10 years. A lot of this is due to the work that Jim Crisp puts into this, and thank you, Jim, for everything that you have done. Fortunately for posterity, we have all of these symposiums on symposias or whatever on DVD, and it's a great collection. It is a great collection. Also, and this is, I'm going to get off the stage just very soon, Jim, so you can get started. In your packet is another white envelope, and that envelope is labeled Save the San Jacinto Battleground Fund. When you have an opportunity, I hope you will actually study its contents, because some of you may know that on February the 4th of this year, the San Jacinto Battleground was named to Preservation Texas' 11 Most Endangered Sites. It's called 11 Most Endangered Places. Please read the material. We appreciate so much your effort. And now, Jim Crisp, if you see me doing this, I'm talking about you.
Not to worry. By popular demand, my introductory remarks have been limited to 5 minutes. Yeah, it was Jeff Dunn who had the crazy idea that not only would you have a San Jacinto Symposium, but you would do it over and over and over again every year. And the brilliance of that idea has been proven over the past 9 years. And it's been proven largely because this was not a narrowly focused symposium, as that list that Jan just read demonstrates. We've had a wide variety of scholars. We're essentially interested, if I can borrow a phrase from myself, in 2 flags over Texas. We're interested in Texas in this symposium from 1821 and the fall of the Spanish Empire in Texas until 1846 and the annexation of Texas to the United States. That quarter century with the Texas Revolution and the Battle of San Jacinto sitting right in the middle of it is a time of enormous change, obviously, in Texas, but it's also, as many of our speakers, especially the Tejano speakers, have demonstrated, it's also a time of extraordinary continuity. And looking at the intertwined changes and continuities in Texas history over that 25-year period is what we've largely been about. Steve Harden is here today. Steve, wave at me if you're out there somewhere. There you are. He's hard to miss. There he is. Steve was, I think, partially responsible for inviting me several years ago to give a talk at the Victoria Goliad Symposium, a very successful one-time symposium when they took us on a tour of the various mission and other archaeological sites around the Victoria Goliad era. And as I told everyone that night, as we were dining on fajitas with strolling mariachis in the interior of the Goliad Presidio, Boy, that's quite a night. As I told them, when you dig, the story changes. That was absolutely proven to us by the reports that the archaeologists gave to us. When you dig, the story changes. Revisionist history is not a very popular term in Texas, and that's too bad, because that phrase works with historians, obviously, as well as archaeologists and anthropologists. When you dig, the story changes. And any working historian who's not simply recycling what he's read or she's read somewhere else, any working historian is a revisionist historian. As they discover new documents, as they look at old documents with new eyes and with new disciplines, any historian worth his or her salt is also a multidisciplinary historian. They call on the expertise of lawyers and anthropologists and economists and forensic bone guys. I think that's the official term that Doug goes by. We have tried to do that in this symposia as well, to get working scholars across many areas of Texas history. And my goodness, as you'll see from my 1-minute introductions for people later on today, we have certainly accomplished that. The first person that I'm going to introduce has told me not to say anything embarrassing about him. And so all I will say is that Jeff Dunn and Jan DeVault, who I almost pushed off the stage, are the founding father and mother. They're not an item. I was staying with Lee and Jeff, and their marriage is safe when I was in Dallas last month. And John, wherever you are out there, Jan is still yours. But for the last 10 years, since they first asked me about doing this out at the San Jacinto site many years ago, Jan and Jeff and those other people that Jan mentioned have just really been working very, very hard without pay through their passion for this history to make this work. Without further ado, my 5 minutes is up, I think. It goes fast. I just want you to welcome the founding father of the San Jacinto Symposium, Jeff Dunn.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. One of the great things we're going to discuss today are these Mexican skulls, and we thought we'd give a little brief background about the Mexican dead at the Battle of San Jacinto to set the proper context. Before I begin, Jan neglected to mention that in the back of the room is a lady, Amanda Danning from Columbus, Texas, who is recreating a Mexican soldier from a CAT scan from one of these skulls. And so we hope that through the day you can watch her progress, and at the end of the day we'll see how far she's gotten along. But the Battle of San Jacinto has played a large role in Texan culture and heritage, and we tend to celebrate and commemorate this year after year on San Jacinto Day, but we often overlooked some of the darker side of this battle, and that is that when you have battle, people get killed. And in this battle, there were people that were killed on both sides, mostly the Mexican side, and that's one of the things that we're going to delve into today. Now, just as a brief overview, for those of you who are not familiar with this, the San Jacinto campaign began shortly after the fall of the Alamo in March of 1836 and ended about 6 weeks later with Sam Houston's army and a division of Santa Anna's army converging in what is now Harris County. The armies confronted each other on April 20th near the junction of Buffalo Bayou and the San Jacinto River. And the sequence of the battle the next day is rather simple. The Texas Army marched across the prairie between the two camps. They fired their rifles and muskets, then the Twin Sisters cannons, and charged the Mexican camp. The Texas Army did not have uniforms. They were not disciplined. And as you can see from this picture, they knew nothing about military precision. But what they did have, and what the military historians called elan, which is a vigorous spirit and enthusiasm, and sometimes that's enough to carry the day. This excerpt from McCardle's famous painting of the battle, which is in the state capitol, gives you a more realistic view of the engagement and the conflict. Now, the Mexican army resisted. They did so very bravely, but the commotion from the Texan attack against their lines quickly led to confusion, and in less than 30 minutes, the Mexican resistance largely ended. The Mexicans threw down their guns and fled or tried to escape on horseback. And what followed has been described by some Texans who participated in the battle as nothing more than a slaughter, because the battle was, for all practical purposes, over. Sam Houston made a feeble attempt to try to stop his men, but the anger over the losses of the Alamo and the Goliad and the rage that was manifested at that time led to a lot of indiscriminate killing for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Many of the Mexican soldiers were on their knees, begging to be spared. In hearing the shouts of Alamo and Goliad, they tried to respond with "Mino Alamo, Mino Goliad" to signify that they had not participated in those bloody engagements. Now, this phase of the conflict occurred in the south part of San Jacinto battlefield, which is south of the present San Jacinto monument. And this part of the battlefield still looks, to me, a little spooky today. But finally, at dusk, about 2 hours later, near Peggy Lake, Colonel Juan Almonte managed to surrender a large portion of the Mexican army, and at that point, the killing ended and the battle was over. The Texans went back to their camp on Buffalo Bayou and brought the prisoners with them. And the next day, Santa Anna himself was captured and brought before Houston. Now, the statistics of this battle are quite remarkable. The Mexicans had upwards of 1,400 men, of whom 630 were killed and 730 prisoners, according to St. Houston's report. And those numbers may be a little high. And of those, 208 were wounded, and only about 40 actually escaped back to the Mexican lines on the Brazos. The Texans, on the other hand, only suffered about 8 killed on the 21st, and 17 wounded. Now, the reaction in the United States was electrifying. Many newspapers in the United States picked up on this story and especially were intrigued by the fact that Santa Anna himself was captured. We also see that overnight the battlefield itself became something of a kind of tourist attraction. It was conveniently located on Buffalo Bayou on the steamboat route between Houston and Galveston, and maps of that era like this one often depicted the location of the battleground as a prominent landmark. Now, the 8 Texans who died on the 21st were buried together a few days after the battle near the Texas Army camp, and their graves were marked. And in 1882, a monument was placed at the site. This was the first monument on the battleground and perhaps one of the first of its kind in Texas. This was the San Jacinto Monument for over 40 years until the big one was built in the 1930s. And this monument still exists today. It's located within the area called the San Jacinto Cemetery. It's often called the Brigham Monument. And it's hidden in the trees next to the parking lot for the battleship Texas. Now, there was no corresponding treatment or dignified treatment of the Mexican dead. And there were no memorials then or now for the Mexican dead. Within days of the battle, the bodies were plundered for valuables. Clothes were even taken off the backs of the corpses. A dentist from the United States was seen walking around with forceps pulling teeth and putting them in a little bag for use in his trade. The person who was most immediately impacted, however, was the landowner, Margaret McCormick, Peggy McCormick. She was an Irish woman and the widow of Arthur McCormick, who received a Mexican land grant from Stephen F. Austin in 1824. Unfortunately, Arthur died while trying to swim Buffalo Bayou the next year, drowned. And Mrs. McCormick came back from the runaway scrape and discovered over 600 corpses in her backyard. She was a feisty lady, and she knew just who to blame for this. It was Sam Houston. And the story is said that she confronted Houston while he lay wounded at the Texas Army camp and demanded that he remove these dead bodies from her land. She didn't ask that they be buried, only that they be removed. And to this, Houston is said to have replied, "Madam, your land will be famed in history as the classic spot upon which the glorious victory of San Jacinto was gained. Here was born, in the throes of revolution, the infant of Texan independence. Here, that latest scourge of mankind, the arrogantly self-styled Napoleon of the West, met his fate." Now, the decorum of this symposium prevents me from giving you her reply to that statement. But suffice it to say, she was not very happy. Several days after the battle, John J. Lynn came to the battlefield from Galveston. And he wrote that a detail was made up of one man from each company of the Texan Army to actually go out and bury the Mexican dead. But it was said that these men refused to obey those orders. Lynn also said that he suggested to Houston that maybe 200 or more of the Mexican prisoners should go out there and do this under a strong Texan guard. And in his words, it ought to be as agreeable to the one as disgusting to the other. Well, this was presented to Santa Anna, who was, of course, a prisoner at that time, and the response was that he expressed total indifference as to what disposition was to be made of these soldiers, and recommended that if fuel was available, to just burn the bodies. Within a few days, this would have been early May, about 10 days after the battle, the smell of the dead Mexican corpses was so bad that the Texas Army simply just moved away. They moved up Buffalo Bayou, took the Mexican prisoners with them, and with that, the problem of the Mexican corpses was just abandoned to the residents in the area, including Peggy McCormick. The stories have come down that the bodies decomposed, and the domesticated cows that were grazing on the battlefield soon began chewing on the bones. This spoiled the milk and the meat, and finally the residents had to get together and decided that they would bury these bones in trenches. Unfortunately, to this day, we do not know where these trenches are, even though our organization, the Friends of San Jacinto Battleground, has been attempting to locate them. But it was also recorded that they left many of the skulls on the ground because they felt that the skulls were too large for the cows to chew upon. And in 1837 and 38, we have this strange phenomenon in the Houston area of people going out to the battleground collecting skulls. And with that, we see John James Audubon, the famous American naturalist who was famous at the time he came to Texas in 1837. He was offered Mexican skulls, and he even went to the battleground and saw the bones laying around. Now, we're going to have Dr. Totter will tell us more about his visit. I will say about this portrait, we used this as the theme for our symposium this year because the expression on Audubon's face makes it appear that he is looking at skulls, slaves, and sex all at the same time. In February 1838, John Herndon of Houston went out to the battleground, and he wrote in his diary that he collected many skulls himself. And he also recorded an incident in Galveston where he witnessed a doctor actually drinking whiskey from a skull. And in August 1838, Gustav Dressel, who's pictured here, visited the battlefield, and he also remarked in his writings that the bones on the battlefield still bear testimony to their numbers. So we see this phenomenon for several years after the battle. And for those of you who are interested, Steve Hardin's most recent book, Texan Macabre, goes into some of this darker side of what was happening in Houston during this period of time. Now, today's program on the skulls and Audubon was made possible by the internet and Google search. This catalog, the Catalog of Human Crania, published in 1857 by the Academy of Natural Science in Philadelphia, popped up in a routine search last year. And it is based on the collection of Dr. Samuel Morton, who was a Philadelphia physician. And in searching through this catalog, we see items here referencing Mexican soldiers who were killed at the Battle of San Jacinto. And 5 of these were donated to Dr. Morton by none other than John James Audubon. Also in this catalog, another skull was donated by W.M. Blackford, who it turns out was a lawyer in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And that skull has evidence that it was handled by Charles Pearson, who lived in Houston in 1837, and presented to Dr. James Cook of Fredericksburg, Virginia. And Cook happened to be the brother of William G. Cook, who was Sam Houston's aide at the Battle of San Jacinto. And the seventh skull that's listed on there is from a Dr. Trudeau, but as Doug Owsley will mention, when this skull was examined, it turned out that it was mislabeled and could not have been a San Jacinto skull, so we ended up with 6 skulls. Now, who was this guy, Samuel George Morton? Frankly, I think he was probably a peculiar fellow myself, but he made it his passion late in his life as a physician to try to collect human crania from all over the world, and he had correspondence throughout the world. And by the end of his life, and when he died in 1851, he had collected up to 1,500 specimens. And what he would do with these is he would measure the internal capacity of these skulls using mustard seeds and then later on leaden shot. And he theorized that intelligence among the races was directly related to brain size. And the larger the brain, the greater the intelligence, and vice versa. And this resulted in some of the first what they viewed at that time as scientific theories dealing with racial superiority. And it turned out that the most intelligent human beings on Earth coincidentally happened to be of Morton's race, which seems very peculiar to me. The question then becomes, did these skulls still exist today? It's one thing to see them in an 1857 catalog, and as I mentioned, the catalog was produced by the Academy of Natural Science, which still operates in Philadelphia. They said that that entire collection had been transferred to the University of Pennsylvania in the 1930s, and this led to a search at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. And sure enough, through the help of Dr. Janet Monge, who's the keeper of anthropology, and this picture comes from her website, by the way, she was able to confirm that these skulls did in fact exist. And with that, our speakers committee decided that this would be a great topic for our symposium, especially if we could get somebody of the stature of Dr. Owsley to do a forensic analysis of this. These skulls are significant to us because they help us understand more about not only Audubon's trip to Texas and what he was doing, but also about the Mexican soldiers who were in the battle. For the first time, we have biological remains of these soldiers, which heretofore really have not been found anywhere on the battlefield. And so this helps us also understand the weapons that were used and a little bit more about the battle by bits and pieces. I just want to say in conclusion, just to follow up on what Jan was saying, is that one of our objectives of this symposium and our Friends group is really to help unlock the secrets of San Jacinto. And what we've been trying to do also is help unlock the secrets of the battleground itself. And the outpouring of support that we've been receiving this last year has been very appreciative, and we are very truly grateful for your attendance today and your support for our mission. So thank you very much, and now it's on to the main speakers.
Thank you, Jeff. Our first speaker, Dr. Ron Tyler, comes to us from the Amon Carter Museum, where he's executive director. A quarter century ago, he was curator there after receiving his PhD from TCU in Fort Worth. And in the intervening time, for about 20 years, Ron is extremely old. And anyone else who interrupts me while I'm giving their introduction will receive similar treatment. As I said last night, Ron has been a mentor and friend of mine since I started seriously messing around with Texas history in the early 1990s, and I'm eternally grateful for that. But Ron carried out that help for me during that intervening couple of decades when he was a professor at the University of Texas in the history department and executive director of the Texas State Historical Association. It would be impossible for me, given the breadth and the depth of Ron's contributions to Texas history, to keep this introduction inside a reasonable time. I'll only mention that among his many works are courses and publications in the visual history and art history of Texas and the West and America. And in the course of that, he's written and edited works on the career of John James Audubon. I don't think we could have brought a better pair to do the presentations that you're about to see, a better pair anywhere in the world than Ron Tyler and Doug Owsley. So without further ado, I will turn the lectern over to Ron.
Thank you, Jim. That introduction will be long remembered, shall we say. I'm delighted to be here. I've attended a previous session of this seminar, and I've always felt that some of the most interesting work being done in the field was revealed at these seminars. So I'm delighted to be here to talk about John James Audubon and the contribution that he made in terms of Texas and the particular reference to the skulls that we're talking about today. Audubon was one of the most famous people really in the world, I guess, by the time he came to Texas in 1837. He arrived on April 24th, and then there's a May 2nd article in the Telegraph and Texas Register that says the U.S. Revenue cutter Campbell, Captain Coast, arrived at Galveston on the 24th, bearing the celebrated ornithologist Audubon and his son. Mr. Harris also accompanies this gentleman, and he is associated with him in scientific researches. Harris was one of Audubon's greatest patrons. Audubon is one of the few Americans whose fame has extended throughout the civilized world and whose services have commanded a national tribute of respect from the United States. That certainly was not always the case, because when Audubon started out, he was not very well received by the naturalists in Philadelphia. And he had to work hard to achieve that distinction. I don't know, can you see any of the type? I didn't know how large the screen was going to be, but you may be having a hard time reading that. But Audubon, over the course of his life, produced an amazing amount of material. First, of course, was the Birds of America, which is a large double elephant folio, 435 plates. That's what he's most famous for. He also did the Ornithological Biography, which is the text that accompanies the Double Elephant Folio books. Then he came back to the United States and did an octavo edition of the Birds of America. Then, without pausing, he began work on the viviparous quadrupeds of North America to do for the animals what he had done for the birds. And then he started, and his sons finished, an octavo edition of the animals. So amazing contribution over a period of a life that lasted from 1785 until 1851. He had to go to Europe, of course, to find a publisher for his work, and he had to go to Europe really to earn a reputation so that the naturalists in Philadelphia would accept him and his work. But by the time he came to Texas in 1837, he was largely accepted and well respected, and indeed a famous person. This is the Double Elephant Folio that he's most famous for. The prints are about 39.5 inches high. They are usually done by engraving, and they are hand colored. So each of the prints is an original, and there is some varying from set to set. But this is the book that he's most famous for. Now, why is he so famous? Well, his contribution was to basically revolutionize the way that birds are presented to the world, if you will. Now, I'm showing you some earlier bird drawings by earlier naturalists. On the right, you see work by Carolinus, and on the left by Matthias Marion. These are dead stuffed birds. There isn't any question about it. And even as naturalists continued to work in depicting birds, this is Mark Catesby, 18th century, one of the most famous naturalists who came to America at that time. And Catesby's birds are still fairly dead and fairly stuffed. That's basically the way they look. The father of American ornithology is Alexander Wilson. And here is Alexander Wilson's eagle. And you can see that it is a virtual copy of the specimen that is still in the Academy of Natural History in Philadelphia. So the birds aren't being very well served by the depiction of them. Audubon was to change that. Audubon came to the United States in 1808 because his father wanted him to get out of France to escape the Napoleonic Wars. His father had purchased a farm near Mill Grove, Pennsylvania, and he sent Audubon over to live on the farm. Not to run the farm, he had an overseer who was running the farm, but young Audubon was to live there and supposedly work and stay out of trouble. And what he did, of course, was he started birding seriously. He had gotten interested in birding in France because one of his father's friends was a birder, and Audubon started birding very seriously while he was at Mill Grove, and one of his favorite places was Perkiomen Creek, which is just down at the foot of the house, which is up on the hill. Well, Audubon's technique, and I show this Dürer print to illustrate his technique. You see there's a screen between the artist and the subject, and that screen is lined off, and on the artist's paper there are identical lines. In other words, each one of those little blocks is the same size. The artist is looking through an eyepiece, if you will, or actually just a sight, so he can keep his eye in the same place. So if the artist keeps his eye in the same place and then fills in on the piece of paper what he sees in each one of those squares, he automatically produces perspective. This was something that Audubon perfected while he was at Mill Grove, and he embroidered upon that by putting the specimen in front of the screen. And in fact, he didn't need a screen. All he needed was another piece of paper lined off in a similar way. So what he was doing was, by reproducing in what he saw on that screen, he was drawing the birds in actual size as well. And that was his goal, to draw all the birds of North America in life size. That explains some of the odd poses in his, or some of the odd looking poses in his drawings, because, for example, the whooping crane is taller than 39 inches. So he had to pose the whooping crane stooping down to pick up a little baby alligator, I'll show you that in just a moment, in order to get the whooping crane on that page of paper. But the whooping crane is reproduced life size, and that was one of Audubon's great claims. See, nobody knew what these birds looked like up close, and many of the birds were unknown anyway, so he wanted to reproduce them life size. This is his contribution to science. Well, with that method of discovery, he added wiring up the birds in animated poses. He would study the birds for weeks and sometimes months at a time before he would kill them and stuff them and wire them in poses that he considered to be natural based on his observations. So his drawings become much more animated. And as he developed this, he also fell in love with the neighbor lady at the next farm at Mill Grove and married her. Her name was Lucy Bakewell, and they started married life together in Louisville, Kentucky, very unsuccessfully because the Panic of 1818 came along and drove him out of business. By 1820, he has decided that he's really going to do what he's passionate about, and that is drawing birds. So he takes a young student named Joseph Mason, whom he had worked with, and they set off down the Mississippi River. And he's going to do what he began to call his great work. He's going to publish all the birds of America in life size. He went down the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, to New Orleans. He spent a few days in New Orleans, actually a few weeks. He would go to the market every day to see what new birds had been brought in. Then his wife came down to join him, and she got a job teaching the children on Oakley Plantation, which is just north of Baton Rouge. And so Audubon went up there and made that his headquarters, and he would spend all day in the forest looking for birds while Lucy was teaching the plantation children. And Joseph Mason helped Audubon come up with some of the most beautiful compositions that are in the Birds of America. Audubon was doing the birds, Mason was doing the flowers and the leaves. Here's the whooping crane, and you can see that this enormous bird has been captured on this 39.5-inch sheet of paper in a very natural pose, stooping down to pick up this little morsel of a baby alligator. This is a self-portrait of Audubon done about this same time. He was very much a backwoodsman, apparently usually dressed in black and slicked his hair down with bear grease, which of course presented some problems when he went to London. But his first trip was to Philadelphia. He had collected all these drawings around Philadelphia, and he wanted to go to Philadelphia, which was sort of the headquarters for naturalists and for the intellectual life of America at this time. He wanted to find a publisher, and he was unsuccessful. He insulted Alexander Wilson. Wilson's reputation in Philadelphia was very high. His book, although Wilson had died, was being continued, it was being enlarged, and the naturalist sort of wrote this backwoodsman off. You can see Audubon in 1822 looking rather dour. You can see him in 1826 looking rather happy, because after he went to Liverpool, he found some support, he found some encouragement. He found people who understood what he was doing, and they really began to encourage him to pursue his dream of publishing The Birds of America. He went to Edinburgh, where he found a printer named William Lazars. Lazars did the first plate of the turkey cock and published a prospectus, which Audubon then used to start heading south toward London, stopping in every village and trying to sell subscriptions to his book, because that was the way he was going to finance the book. And he had some wonderful plates, some wonderful illustrations. This is the Baltimore Oriole, to show his subscribers as he went south. When he finally arrived in London, he had sold several subscriptions and was sending all the information back to Lazars and saying, ship the first portfolio to Mr. and Ms. So-and-so. Well, he got a note from Lazars that said, I can't fulfill the orders because my colorists are all on strike. And I have tried using students, and they're just not good enough. This work is far too demanding. So Audubon had to find a new printer while he was in London, and he ran into, this was apparently near where he was staying, near the British Museum. He ran into Havel's Zoological Gallery. Robert Havel was a dealer in natural history specimens. He was also an engraver, and his son Robert Jr. was an engraver. So together the Havels agreed to take on Audubon's great work. So Audubon transferred the printing to London, and again, some beautiful specimens came as a result of that collaboration. Audubon was really lucky. He had probably encountered the two best engravers, certainly in Europe, maybe even in the world at that time. And this was a time when lithography was beginning to gain some traction, and people were turning to lithography because it was a little bit cheaper than engraving. And so engraving was sort of going out, if you will. And so Audubon caught these two fellows at the height of their game, if you will. And that's one reason The Birds of America is so beautiful and so well respected, because the prints are beautiful. But as you can see, Audubon's work is revolutionary. Compare these images to the dead stuffed birds that I showed you at the beginning. They're animated, they're beautiful, they're interesting, And of course, because, we hadn't learned to fly at that time ourselves, and so we all kind of envied the birds for their ability to fly and to get that bird's eye view that became so popular in the 19th century. Here's another example of the Virginian partridge, in which Audubon has just captured, it seems to me, the entire idea of romanticism, of exoticism, of color, of emotion, of ferocity. Look at the hawk. Look at the partridges, how they're fleeing. Their home has been invaded by this murderer, if you will, and they're in panic, of course, and the hawk has murder in his eye. And Audubon has captured all of that, and of course, it's a beautiful picture as well. The color is vivid and exciting, and all this is very much a part of the romantic movement of the period. He uses color and space very well, as in the snowy owls, and of course, the pileated woodpecker. Wonderful illustration. Well, Audubon is engaged in this project, and of course, he realizes after he's gotten it started, after he's sold a number of subscriptions, that he hasn't gotten all the birds yet. So he has to go back to the United States and continue his research. So he goes to Charleston, where he has the good fortune of meeting the Reverend John Bachman, a Lutheran minister in Charleston. Bachman is a preeminent naturalist in his own right. He specializes in quadrupeds. They would later collaborate on a book on the viviparous quadrupeds. But Bachman takes Audubon in. He spends several months in Charleston, where he got, again, some of the most beautiful images. Audubon always worked with an assistant. In this case, George Lehmann, a German artist, did the background, the beautiful view of Charleston. Of course, Audubon, again, did the birds. But while he's in Charleston and working in that area, he gets the beautiful view of the snowy heron with the plantation in the background. He went down to Florida and got the water birds with the Everglades in the background. Audubon is documenting the American landscape at the same time he's documenting the birds of America. He went up to Labrador in 1833, and by 1837, he had not made a trip west. He had wanted to go on a western trip ever since he started the project. He tried to sign up as an artist on the Long expedition in 1820, but he was not accepted. So he really needed a western trip, and he thought Texas might be it. He knew that Texas was now a young independent republic, and he felt like he had to make that western trip in order to complete the birds of America, because there may be birds out there that he hadn't seen. He said, "I'm extremely sorry to read in the papers the sinister accounts of the warfare in Texas, where I so much long to go. We hope that all these troublesome affairs will be at an end when we reach you." He's in London writing at that time. His son Victor says, "We are yet uncertain where you're going to after you quit the Gulf of Mexico. I trust not 1 foot in Texas." So there's some apprehension about coming to Texas at this time. They know that there's a war still raging in the Gulf of Mexico, a naval war, and so he's being warned not to go to Texas. Now, Audubon, of course, at this time did not know about the naturalist who had been in Texas before him. He did not know about Mier y Terran's scientific and boundary survey that had taken place in Texas in 1829. And he was accompanied part of the way by a Swiss naturalist named Jean-Louis Berlandier, who was documenting the animals and the birds and the plants, primarily of South Texas, but also some into East Texas. He was also documenting the people of Texas, including the Indians, and made a beautiful series of about 20 or 30 watercolor sketches of the Indians of Texas. Nor did he know of the work of William Drummond, a Scotsman who had been sent to Texas from what is today Kew Garden. Drummond was in Texas in 1833, and he was studying the plants, the wildflowers of Texas, and he sent seeds and specimens back to Kew Garden. Fortunately, he did, because he died in a cholera epidemic in New Orleans in 1834 and didn't get back himself, but his specimens and his seeds did, and so they were able to publish in Curtis's Botanical Magazine a whole series of illustrations of the Texas wildflowers between 1834 and 1836. And what you're seeing on the left, as far as I'm aware, is the first illustration of the Texas bluebonnet. Even Mary Austin Holly had written about birds in Texas. She said, "The principal specimens of the feathered tribe in Texas are mostly such as are well known in the United States, and therefore need no description." Well, Audubon perhaps could have saved himself a trip if he had known that, but he might not have taken her at her word. You never know. Audubon was great at convincing people to help him. He had a whole network of naturalists that he corresponded with. They each collected specimens for each other and traded specimens, and at times sold specimens to help finance their trips. So Audubon would come back from every trip that he made with barrels full of specimens stuffed in rum. Well, he needed some support for his trip to Texas, so he had a friend who was the commander of the topographical engineers, who set up an appointment with him with President Jackson. So he went to see Jackson, had dinner with Jackson, and he said, "I sat close to him and we spoke of olden times and touched slightly upon politics. I found him very averse to the cause of Texas." And this is in 1836. So he's getting ready for his trip to Texas. Jackson ultimately is able to help him arrange for the cutter that he took to Galveston Bay. And this is, as far as I know, the earliest picture of Galveston Bay. It was done in 1839 and published about 1847. Now, John Woodhouse Audubon, Audubon's son, was with him on the trip, and he did a camera lucida view, a drawing of Galveston. Unfortunately, that view is not known to exist. And Audubon writes, "John took a view of the rough village of Galveston with the lucida. We found much company on board and returned to the vessel, among whom there was a contractor for beef in the Army," and this is the man that Jeff alluded to who said he would collect some skulls and give them to Audubon. Now, why was Audubon wanting skulls? Well, he was a very good friend of Dr. Samuel Morton. They had been trading correspondence for years. They had been trading specimens for years. Morton would send Audubon birds, and so Audubon was trying to help him with his collection of skulls. Why was he collecting skulls? The foremost question among naturalists of the day in the 1830s was the origin of the species. Where did we come from? Was it the biblical description, or was it some other kind of origin? That was the big question. So naturalists were studying every element of nature, but that was the overriding question. So if you could gather skulls from all over the world and get, different races represented, maybe we could begin to determine whether there was a unified origins or whether there were separate origins. That was the goal of the naturalists of that period, and Dr. Samuel Morton was one of the leaders in studying craniology. And of course, this is also the time of phrenology. You might have noticed that Audubon said the man who was going to help him bumped with botanical bumps. He was talking about bumps in the skull because of the study of phrenology. Well, after Audubon arrived at Galveston, they took a boat up. This is San Jacinto River. They took a boat up the San Jacinto off to Buffalo Bayou, and then on into Houston. Audubon says, we landed at the capital of Texas, drenched to the skin, and we were kindly received on board the steamer Yellowstone. Shanties, cargoes of hogsheads, barrels. We were spread among the landing, and the Indians drunk and hallooing and stumbling about in the mud in every direction. Many of them were young and well-looking, and with far less decorations than I've seen before. We're very fortunate to have some excellent descriptions of Texas from Audubon's journal, or from the surviving parts of Audubon's journal. He said, as soon as we arose above the bank, we saw before us a level of far extending prairie, destitute of timber and rather poor soil, houses half finished, most of them without roofs. Tents and a liberty pole with the Capitol were exhibited to our view at once. We approached the president's mansion, however, wading through water above our ankles. This abode of President Houston is a log house consisting of 2 rooms and a passage through after the Southern fashion. The moment we stepped over the threshold, on the right hand of the passage, we found ourselves ushered into what in other countries would be called the antechamber. The ground floor, however, was muddy and filthy. A large fire was burning. A small table covered with paper and writing materials was in the center. Camp beds, trunks, and different materials were strewn around the room. We were at once presented to several members of the cabinet, some of whom bore the stamp of men of intellectual ability, simple though bold in their appearance. Here we were presented to Mr. Crawford, an agent of the British minister to Mexico who had come here on some secret mission. He says that while they were waiting to see President Sam Houston, we amused ourselves by walking to the Capitol, and this is Mary Austin Hawley's drawing of the Capitol in December of 1837, a little bit after Audubon's visit. We amused ourselves by walking to the Capitol, which was yet without a roof, and the floors and benches and tables of both houses of Congress were well saturated with water, as our clothes had been in the morning. We invited one of the great men of the place to enter, we were invited by one of the great men of the place to enter a booth and take a drink of grog with him. We did so, but I was rather surprised that he offered his name instead of cash to the barkeep. He said, we first caught sight of President Houston as he walked from one of the grog shops where he had been to prevent the sale of ardent spirits. He was on his way to the house and wore a large gray coarse coat. And the bulk of his figure reminded me of the appearance of General Hopkins of Virginia, for like him, he is upwards of 6 feet high and strong in proportion. But I observed a scowl in the expression of his eyes that was forbidding and disagreeable. We reached the abode before him, but he came soon, and we were presented to His Excellency. He was dressed in a fancy velvet coat and trousers trimmed with broad gold lace. Around his neck was tied a cravat, somewhat in the style of '76. He received us kindly and was desirous of retaining us for a while and offered us every facility within his power. He at once removed us from the anteroom into his private chamber, which, by the way, was not much cleaner than the former. We were severally introduced by him to different members of the cabinet and staff, and at once asked to drink grog with him, which we did, wishing success to the new republic. Our talk was short, but the impression which was made upon my mind at the time by himself and his officers and his place of abode can never be forgotten. Audubon had a wonderful time in Texas. It was a great place to hunt, and of course that's what he did with most of his time, because he had to acquire specimens. And he acquired a lot of specimens while he was in Texas. We don't know how many, because I think some of them were lost on the way back. As he was leaving, he went back down Buffalo Bayou, of course, and visited the grounds at the battlefield, and that's when he noted that the bones of the Mexican soldiers were still strewn around the battlefield. After Audubon's departure, Senator Stephen Everett introduced a resolution into Congress to recognize Audubon as an honorary citizen of the Republic of Texas, but as John Jenkins writes in his book on Audubon in Texas, the gesture met a snag in the Foreign Relations Committee and failed to pass. Audubon's comment as he left Texas was, "Nobody bought my book." He was dealing, of course, with a fledgling country where there was no money. Perhaps he might have sold a book if he'd been willing to accept a trade. I'm not sure. Well, Audubon wrote after his visit to Texas, "More than 2/3 of our species occur here. We found not one new species, but the mass of observations that we have gathered connected with the ornithology of our country has, I think, never been surpassed. I feel myself now tolerably competent to give an essay upon the geographical distribution of the feathered tribes of our dear country." This image that I'm showing you of Havel's tern, and Havel's tern was named after his printer, Robert Havel, might be one of the few drawings that Audubon actually changed or altered in some way as a result of his visit to Texas, because he did encounter the terns in Texas, and he had already done a drawing of the terns, but the published work is slightly different from the drawing. And so he might have altered that drawing based on his observations in Texas. He did gather other specimens. This is, of course, the famous mockingbird, which he had done while he was in Louisiana years ago. But he did collect a rattlesnake in Texas, and it was, as he says, "I had the grand fortune to procure specimens of my climbing rattlesnake." Now, this is reference to one of the early scandals of his career. When he published this picture, all the naturalists in Philadelphia said, "This is a fake. Rattlesnakes don't climb trees. And by the way, also, the fangs don't look like that." So they said the Audubon later admitted, I think, that this was a fence post rather than a tree. But the naturalists really attacked him for this picture. He says, "I found specimens of my climbing rattlesnake with double recurred fangs, which I am told will prove to be a new genre, and therefore Messrs. Ord and Waterton, good souls, those were the people who attacked him primarily. So he was glad to find this rattlesnake because it really proved that his drawing is correct. And of course the drawing was correct because he had drawn from an actual specimen before. But now he had, Audubon early in his career didn't keep his specimens all the time, so he didn't have proof. He soon caught on that he had to hang on to the specimens in order to answer the other naturalists who were attacking him. What happened to the Texas species that he collected? Well, he initially feared that they were lost. And he starts writing to his friends about, have they arrived yet? Where are they? That sort of thing. And he writes to Brewer in Boston, who is a naturalist and a collector and a newspaper editor. And at least one, if not 5 barrels of my birds in rum collected when on the shores of the Mexican Gulf are also missing, and one contained the skulls of Indians and so forth, intended, some of them, for friends in Philadelphia. This might have been Morton's skulls. Later he writes to Harris, I am glad that you received the barrel of skulls and one of the boxes of eggs. So we know that some of the specimens were finally delivered to Harris. They showed up in the book on craniology that Jeff mentioned. And Audubon, after his Texas trip, then went back to London, where he brought the Birds of America to a conclusion the very next year. So he made his trip to Texas right before he finished the great work. He immediately embarked, as I said, in the viviparous quadrupeds of North America and the octavo edition of the birds. His son, John Woodhouse Audubon, came back to Texas while doing research on the quadrupeds. So you get the wonderful picture of the nine-banded armadillo, the red Texan wolf, the jackrabbit. These are wonderful pictures. Audubon was one of the few people who, by selling subscriptions to his book, became a somewhat wealthy man. And this is the house that he built for his family on the shores of the Hudson River, where he lived to a ripe old age, dying in 1851. His trip to Texas was a highlight for him, and perhaps we have some objects from that trip that will occupy us for the rest of the day.
I hope so.
Thank you.
It's always our practice, as many of you know, to wait until the end of the day and bring all of our speakers up to see if you can bombard them with questions, all censored by me. But it's also our practice when someone finishes with a little bit of time left, and we have under 10 minutes, but over 5 minutes, to see if there are any immediate questions, if Dr. Tyler would be willing to answer any that come to mind immediately after seeing his presentation. So there are bright lights in my eyes, so you'll have to sort of wave and scream and jump up and down. But if anyone has a question, yes, ma'am, go ahead with your question.
Would you say a little more about the person who preceded Audubon in Texas, who had already documented a number of animals and birds, and what was his name?
Jean-Louis Berlandier. He was a Swiss naturalist in the employ of the Mexican government. In 1828, Mier y Terran led an expedition into Texas. It was a boundary survey because they were surveying the boundary between the United States and Mexico, but it was also a naturalist history expedition. And of course, it was an expedition to assess the situation in Texas, because by 1828, there were some rumblings that some of the settlers in Texas might not be thoroughly happy with their situation. So it was a combination trip. And Berlandier was with Mier y Terran on part of that trip and did the drawings, which are in the Smithsonian, at Harvard. I think they're at a museum in Europe. And the Indian drawings are at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Ron, there's a 2-volume set, right, published by the TSHA of the
Yes,
Berlandier
it's
drawings?
unfortunately called A Journey to Mexico, yes. But it's Berlandier's journal of his trip to Texas, which of course was Mexico at the time, and that's what he called it, so that's why it was titled that. But I think that didn't help our sales on the volume.
Are those still in print at the TSHA? I think they're out of print.
I think they're still in print, but I'm
Still
not
in
sure.
print, I hope
Yeah.
so. Manuel Hinojosa.
I read somewhere that Audubon went down the Rio Grande River, I guess right after Treaty Guadalupe, and went all the way to Zapata to study the Roadrunner. You know, the fact that he died in 1851, and you also mentioned his son. I'm just wondering if you know of an event that took place around that time, or going to down the river, Rio Grande River.
No, Audubon didn't go past Houston, really.
Okay.
He came up the river, spent some time in Houston, hunted up and down the river, spent some time at Galveston, and then went back.
We have time for the 2 more questions from the gentleman on each side. Yes, Roger?
Is there any idea if there are manuscript field notes from Audubon on his visit, and if so, do they survive? And are they...
No, that's an interesting story in itself. Audubon's granddaughter, Mariah, edited his journals, Baudelarizing them as she did it, and then destroying them. So the Texas Journal was destroyed. All we have, and the Texas Journal was sort of recompiled by Samuel Wood Geiser in his, I think, 1948 book on the Naturalists of Texas. And what he did is he pulled all of the text from the ornithological biography, from the octavo edition of the Birds of America. In other words, all of Audubon's published writings that he could find, he brought back together and then organized them in what appeared to be a chronological way. And that's as close as we have to Audubon's journal, other than what Mariah published herself in 1898. And there is a section on Texas in her published journals, But as I said, she Baudelarized some of them, we know, so you have to use them with care.
Yes, sir.
On the Berlandier, the information about the Indians, what's the best place to access that?
They're at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa.
Gilcrease?
There's a book called Indians of Texas in 1830 that was published, oh gosh, late 60s, early 70s by John Ewers, and they're published in that book. I don't think they're all published, though. I'm not sure, because I showed you pictures of a couple of Mexican horsemen as well, and I'm not sure that all those got into Ewers' book because he was talking about the Indians. These are fabulous little watercolors, Texas in 1828 to 1830, and they're just not that well known. And part of the reason is they're in a bound book. So even if you want to exhibit them, you have to, open the book and exhibit them one at a time.
Right.
Dr. Siracusa, one last question, please.
Good morning. My maiden name is Bachman, and I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with Audubon books and prints, and was told that a relative of ours, John Bachman, who was a pastor in the Carolinas, had, as a friend, helped Audubon write some of his texts. Are you familiar with John Bachman?
Oh, yes, he did. He was the author of the Viviparous Quadrupeds text. The book would have never gotten done without Dr. Bachman. Yeah.
Thank you.
They became lifelong friends. Audubon's two sons married two of Bachman's daughters, who unfortunately died fairly young of tuberculosis. So they had close family connections and kept in touch throughout the rest of Audubon's life.
Thank you for those questions. You've already heard us mention our next speaker, Dr. Douglas Owsley. He comes to us from Washington, D.C., where he is the curator and head of the Division of Physical Anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of Natural History. He is, as you will read in your program, a research specialist in skeletal biology, and I've seen here that he's examined more than 10,000 skeletons. He also must be a very old man. Also an expert in forensic anthropology, historic populations of North America, the Plains Indians, Polynesia. You can find him on YouTube. Giving interesting lectures on the internet, samples of, I hope, what he's going to be doing today. He is a particular expert on the examination of human bone and what one might be able to learn from those examinations. And I want you to give a very warm welcome to Dr. Douglas Owsley, please.
And if I can get it darker. Okay. Just make me go right here, Greg.
He's the man.
It's a great pleasure to talk to you this morning. This presentation is with two of my colleagues, Dr. Richard Jantz and Karin Brulheid, who is with the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Jantz is at the University of Tennessee. This presentation presents baseline information on 6 crania from the San Jacinto Battleground that are part of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology Samuel George Morton Cranial Collection. The Friends of San Jacinto Battleground sponsored this presentation and this investigation, and I would like to give special thanks to Jan DeVault and Jeff Dunn. As practicing forensic anthropologists, our team works with law enforcement agencies and medical examiners on the identification of human skeletons. We work on human identification cases that either involve badly decomposed remains or skeletonized remains. Situations where you cannot look at the remains and say who that person is. So the primary objective of a forensic anthropologist in many cases is to assist in establishing positive identification and then also evaluating the evidence that helps determine the cause of death. Much of our work concerns contemporary missing persons cases, but it also extends to mass disasters. And that would include, for instance, in my case, working in Europe with Croatia, for example, or assisting with identification of Pentagon plane crash victims, or in case of Texas a while back with the Waco Branch Davidian compound members. I'm trained as an anatomist, but I'm also trained, and my team is trained partly as archaeologists. We know how to go into the field, how to search for, and how to excavate, recover buried remains. And our recovery sites, when we're doing this work, it's very carefully documented, and in some cases, then we serve as expert witnesses in court of laws interpreting the site to a jury. As research scientists, we apply these techniques that we do with our contemporary investigations to the study of human remains dating to the historic and prehistoric periods. And our knowledge and training in human anatomy and extensive experience derived from analyzing thousands of human skeletons is what is our baseline. As you can read a book, my team can read bone. The human skeleton can tell you much about the life of the individual, not just about their death. Sometimes our historical research deals with the examination of the remains of soldiers, and in my case, because of where I'm located at the Smithsonian in a federal system, it's included examinations of soldiers dating to the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and also more extensively the Civil War. It has been both fascinating and a privilege to assist with the examination and identification of historic period military remains, including, in my case, the crew that went down with the Confederate submarine off of Charleston, the submarine, the H.L. Hunley in South Carolina, or the Union ironclad, the Monitor. And then also in terms of Texas, some of my very first exposure, your Confederate soldiers that were killed in the Battle of Glorieta Pass near Santa Fe, New Mexico. This past summer, my team examined men from the opposing force, Union soldiers that were killed during the Battle of Val Verde and buried at Fort Craig, New Mexico. Well, this presentation that I'm giving you today really has a surprising origin, sort of a who would have thought it type issue. And that is the actual preservation of human remains from the San Jacinto battlefield. They have not been lost, but instead very carefully maintained as part of an early and irreplaceable anatomical collection that even today remains a valuable resource for scientific research. Samuel George Morton was a medical doctor and a member of the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences, and he assembled this unique collection from 1832 until his death in 1851. Working with worldwide contacts, including anatomists, naturalists, military surgeons, and missionaries, he acquired crania from every occupied continent. This renowned collection that at his death numbered 867 was a collection that was carefully labeled, and it, in this country, predates any other anatomical collection that we know of and work with today. Dr. Morton's archival records and catalog, published in 1849, provide information about the recovery context, the identity, and the original collector. And he assigned, as the specimens came in, he assigned consecutive catalog numbers to each cranium recorded on the bone in durable India ink. The 5 San Jacinto crania collected by John James Audubon in the spring of 1837 are numbered 555 to 558 and also number 690. And they are identified, as you will see, by printed labels attached to the frontal bone that state Mexican soldier slain at San Jacinto. 4 of these crania have another label that were affixed by Morton to the side of the cranium. And these labels, in conjunction with Morton's 1849 catalog, provide information on the location of recovery, his estimate as to the man's age at death, information about ancestry, unusual pathology, and the name of the collector. The 5th one that Dr. Morton included in his collection is numbered 689, and it is labeled a little differently. It says Mexican, both in ink and in the tag that he affixed to the frontal bone, and it has, as you will see, an inscribed chain of custody that is written across the right side of the cranium that says Charles A. Pearson, to Dr. James Cook, and Dr. Cook to Samuel Morton. Dr. Morton's concern with documentation makes this collection a valuable resource for scientific research today for individuals that are concerned with population variation and then how it's changed from, say, the 1830s and that time period to the present day, something that we would refer to as looking at secular change in cranial morphology. After Dr. Morton's death, the collection was donated to the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences, and during the mid-1960s, the collection was then transferred to the University of Pennsylvania on loan to the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, where it was then formally transferred and is part of that collection, and there it is very carefully maintained and available for research. For this research, we assembled an experienced forensic anthropology team to examine these crania, and it was comprised of 5 individuals, 4 from the Smithsonian Institution. One is the science photographer whose photographs you'll be seeing in a minute. His name is Chip Clark, and in my opinion, he is the best natural history science photographer I've ever had the privilege of working with. 2 of them are my research assistants, and then the third, the final individual is from the University of Tennessee. He is Professor Emeritus Dr. Richard Jantz, who is my dissertation advisor from over 30 years ago, and he specializes in quantitative morphometric variation in craniofacial morphology among human populations. Now, I'll explain a little bit about what that means, but I would also say at the UPenn Museum collection, we were graciously received, and our work was given special assistance, particularly by Dr. Janet Monge, who is a keeper of the museum's physical anthropology collection. As we do this is a baseline forensic analysis, so we're going to examine the remains, first doing an inventory so we know exactly what is preserved, examine the individual for determining age, sex, any descriptions of pathology we will make, noting pathology that occurred, injuries that occurred prior to the battle, as well as information as to cause of death. We are examining the remains for any type of dental pathology as well. As a military series, one of the things that I expected was that these men would be mostly young adults. The ages assigned by Dr. Morton presents an older profile. Dr. Morton, in the 1830s and 40s, assigned ages that 2 of them, he said, were about 30 years of age, 3 were 40 years of age, and 1 was 50. Now, standards for determining age have improved a great deal, and I would have to say that Dr. Morton's estimates are too high, as you'll see for some of these men. But this series is not comprised of teenagers. Now, Dr. Jantz is a specialist in quantitative genetics and quantitative morphology, studies of quantitative morphology. And with this, what he did was take each cranium and digitize it. And that means that he has a type of instrument that he can go to very specific landmarks on the cranium and make measurement determinations that determine the X, Y, Z coordinates. So he's describing the skull 3-dimensionally in its shape. And what we have through collections like Dr. Morton's, but others that have been built in the succeeding decades, reference population data. And included in that, from our work in forensics, we would have, for example, Mexican Americans. We would also have, as comparison, a number of European groups that will figure into these analyses, as well as American whites, contemporary American whites, as well as 19th century American whites. And we would also include several Native American tribes, including Guatemalans, Mayans, the Chumash from Southern California, and the Zuni as a southwestern group from New Mexico. Now, as a whole, when Dr. Jantz takes these measurements, he can then ask the question to what population sample is this particular cranium most like? And we do this all the time in terms of forensic anthropology, and we can do this type of identification and have these very complete reference samples to compare to. And in this case, the cranial morphology, the craniofacial morphology, what they look like metrically of the San Jacinto series is fairly homogeneous with the exception of one cranium, the one that I will start with first, which is number 690. And this individual, unlike the others, appears to be of unmixed European ancestry. He does not show features that you see in the other individuals, the other 5 from this series. His closest comparison groups are those that represent old world Europeans. He's not, as we would say, what an American white looks like either. He classifies with Europeans. The remaining 5 individuals show features consistent with an admixed European Native American origin, as we see in many Hispanics, many Mexicans. As part of our examination, we also document bone preservation, and in my field, this is recognized as making a taphonomic assessment, which considers the postmortem processes that can alter bones. Now, this series is homogeneous in its preservation, and it was collected after soft tissue decomposition had occurred. The crania are in exceptionally good condition, and with only minor exception, are free of desiccated tissue. They show no indication of sun bleaching or exfoliation of the outer table, and this indicates that they were not exposed to weathering for an extended period of time. None of these crania show modifications caused by animal scavenging. And as forensic scientists, we see this a lot in our police work. We see frequently, for instance, in my case, damage caused by rodents, and can recognize different types of rodents, what a rat does, for example, or carnivores such as dogs and coyotes. And I do a lot of West Virginia cases, and I see the types of destruction that can be caused by bears, and I see this fairly routinely. Now, the bones that I'll be showing you do not show this type of damage, but it's interesting to me that historic accounts of the battleground report that cows chewed up nearly all of the human bones that were exposed. Now, this is very interesting because I don't usually see this in my forensic work, but it is documented, it's well documented, that cattle will eat bone. And it's a condition that is referred to as osteophagic behavior. And they've done controlled dietary studies, and they link this, in the case of cattle, to an appetite for phosphate caused by a phosphorus deficiency. And in the case of cows, bone is the most common source of phosphorus that a cow is likely to encounter. Now, I have had a great interest in Texas history, and I've had opportunities to work on Texans in the past. And so when I'm involved in this, as you will see, I began focusing, because I'm very concerned with bone pathology and cause of death, that sort of thing. I do interpretations that are looking at, for one thing, in a battlefield situation, different types of trauma, how you interpret traumatic injuries. This is a forensic case, and when I'm looking at this, for instance, I see an entrance gunshot wound to the forehead, to the frontal bone, bone in front, with radiating fractures. You can identify an entrance and you can differentiate it from an exit. An entrance wound, if it strikes direct, you will have internal beveling. It blows the bone surface away on the internal as it passes through, and it leaves a very sharply defined entry. The bone, as it is struck and it exits, the bone will often be larger. It's generally larger in terms of an exit wound because that bullet will flatten, that bullet may start to tumble, and so when it exits, it usually leaves a larger exit wound, and we see this in this man's exit here in the occipital bone. The back portion is the occipital. And from that, we see then a larger opening with external beveling. Now, all of the skulls that I'll be showing you, you can always tell if someone's used to working with skulls by how they photograph them. And this type of position that you're seeing here is called the Frankfurt horizontal. And the Frankfurt horizontal is essentially the carrying angle of the head. We will always start out with this. I'll show you some different views of these individuals, and then when I'm focusing in on pathology, I'll come in and we'll work with some different angles. Now, I've had the opportunity to work on some of your very interesting Texans in the past. One of the individuals that we identified was a gunfighter named Wild Bill Longley. My first exposure to Texas history was when I was working and asked to identify Ben Milam. And Ben Milam, as you know from your very intense interest, was a leading figure in the Texas Revolution, and he was a Kentuckian and had served in the War of 1812. And we examined his remains when his monument in San Antonio was being moved in Milam Park. He is best known for his call for volunteers to storm the city of San Antonio in December 1835 with his impassioned plea, "Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio?" Now, in that process, he was shot in the head, and he was killed instantly. And as we look at his cranium, we're seeing the left parietal, so the left side of the head, left parietal here, and you're seeing a classic exit wound with the external bevel as it goes in. The frontal portion was not preserved. The bullet struck him somewhere in the forehead area, and then exited the top left side of his head. Now, he was 47 years of age at the time he was killed. As we do examinations, one of the things that we will look at is all aspects of the bone, and if we look at Mr. Milam's dentition, for instance, one of the first things that I'm drawn to is the fact that he liked his pipe, and you've got a well-defined, in the lower jaw, the mandible, a well-defined pipe facet here, where the pipe stem, clay pipe stem, is harder than the tooth surface, and through working with it and chomping on it, it will form a naturally formed circular groove. He referred to himself as Old Ben Milam, and I can see, even though 47 years of age, I can see evidence as to why he perhaps at times felt like that. For one thing, as with your Texans, they would be accomplished horsemen, and if we see someone growing up on a horse, we can pick it up in the bones. Different muscle attachments are exaggerated, the spine suffers badly, and one of the things that we frequently see in horsemen, for instance, are herniated discs and collapse. This is the vertebral end plate here, and you can see these herniations of the schmorals, called schmorals depressions, where the vertebra is from the force is compressing. So he has moderate arthritic changes in the spinal column. He has wedging of his vertebra. He has these types of herniations. And when I look at his knees, for instance, one of the things that you can see is he had some serious knee problems in the sense that this is his femur. So we're looking at the femur and the joining tibia, and all of these are going to be arthritic changes. All of these are arthritic changes. He would be, now 47, too young, but had he survived and gone on and was alive today, he would be a good candidate for a knee replacement. This is the first of your Mexican soldiers. This is the one that Dr. Morton identified as number 690, and you see the way that he has labeled it. It is the color that all of these are. The patina that they pick up from the natural environment is a brown color, and there is small amounts of adhering soil to these bones. Dr. Morton did probably some cleaning, but not extensive cleaning. And as we look at the numbers, and it's hard for me to see on this angle, but one of the things that you're going to see is you'll see a number up here that he assigned. That's the Morton 690 catalog number. And then you'll see an additional L606, and that is the original Academy of Sciences loan number to Penn Museum. And then you see the attached label that I mentioned, Mexican soldiers slain at San Jacinto, and that is a Morton catalog number, and it is those records that really help us in terms of identification. Now, as I focus in on this fellow and I began to look at what the bones are telling me, one of the things that I would say is that this individual, the shape of his nose, the shape of the skull, all of these features indicate that his ancestry is European, unmixed European. And it's interesting, Dr. Morton, because of his worldwide breadth of examining crania, he could identify individuals that were of different ancestry, and he pointed out that this individual, he wrote mixed Indian and Spaniard, ? And he assigned an age of 30 years. Now, he's recognizing a different ancestry in this, not the European that we would quite emphasize, but he's questioning it in relation to the others. This male, in terms of his craniofacial morphology and his genetic features, is European. His age is younger. It's 20 to 24 years of age. One of the things that you'll see is that there are a number of teeth that are missing in this individual. Now, one of the things about teeth, and I'll be showing you the cranium and the maxillary dentition, is that you tend to have, in a collection that is out in the field, postmortem loss, and it tends to be fairly extensive, particularly of the front teeth. The incisors, the canines, and premolars are single-rooted teeth, and so with decomposition, they tend to fall out. The anterior teeth tend to fall out fairly easily, whereas you will be more often seeing molars, and molars that are upper jaw molars have 3 roots, and it tends to lock them in fairly securely. It may not be totally visible to you, but what I'm focusing on in this photograph is his nasal conchae. They are part of the ethmoid bone. They're scroll-like bones inside, and in this particular individual, inside the nasal chamber, by normal standards, this man's nasal conchae shows signs of chronic inflammation due to allergies. This fellow, when he was here, he was suffering at times from a runny nose. And here are the teeth, so I'm talking about loss of anterior teeth. That's very common. and a left side view of the cranium. An additional label that was put on this by Morton. Now I'm going to focus in on this area right here, and this is a partially healed, tear-shaped, bladed injury along the temporal line. So the temporal line that you're seeing, and it's approximately, it measures 13 millimeters in length in a front to back, anterior, posterior type of view, and it has a maximum width of about 5 millimeters. And this is a strike from a weapon in which the outer table, the outer bone surface was pressed inward, and it actually penetrated through the outer table, the inner cancellous bone, the diplo, and into the inner table, such that when you look at it, when you put a light inside, for instance, you can see through, and the line of penetration measures approximately 7 millimeters in length. So this is an injury that is partially healed. This is not something by the degree of healing that would have occurred, say, at the Alamo. This is longer healing, but it is a blade that struck him here. I don't know exactly what to put forward, whether you're talking a saber tip, a bayonet, but it's something that struck him right here and caused a serious injury, but he was surviving. Shows also then two conditions. That's an antemortem injury. Shows two conditions that we think are perimortem injuries. The left lower frontal bone, which I'm zeroing in on right here, this is the left forehead in this area, has a very small perforation with a depressed margin that opens into the frontal sinus. You can see in there, and the discoloration. One of the things that we can tell is recent breaks from old breaks, and it is the discoloration of this inwardly depressed margin that indicates that it's an old, meaning going back to the time of Audubon and before that, old perimortem at the time of death type of injury. And this is a very small impact area. It measures 5 millimeters by 4 millimeters. He also has a traumatic blow to the alveolar region, to the mouth area. And when we look at his maxillae, the upper jaw, he has perimortem fracturing of these teeth. There are, when you study them closely, you see that the sockets are damaged. You'll see that there are radiating fractures. There is missing bone. And all of this type of damage that has occurred in this area here is something that we would, in the overall combined appearance of these fractures, think that these teeth had some help in coming loose in the fact that there was a blow that occurred at the time of death to this man. And we're looking closely here at this damage that occurs right in here. This is all loss, extra loss of bone, and it's old fracture, old stained fracture edges. This is the second man. This is the one that was identified as 555. Now this cranium is in good condition. It has sandy sediment in the ear holes, the external auditory meatus, and in some of the foramina, some of the different perforations in the skull. And it has a little bit of loss, post-mortem loss, of the tips of the nasal bones. Dr. Morton assigned an age of 40 years to this individual, and we would say that by current standards, he's actually fairly close, that he's about 35 to 42 years of age. There are only a few teeth that are present in the cranium, and part of that is antemortem loss that has occurred earlier in life. He's lost a tooth here. This tooth here, an incisor, had come out. The right maxillary first incisor was lost during life, and its socket was in the process of remodeling at the time of death. He's also lost a left first premolar, and he has some teeth that show periapical abscesses, meaning he has had, due to a cavity, a broach of the pulp chamber, and it has led to a cavity. So he has some abscesses. He has two teeth that were lost antemortem, and it was remodeling, and he has two abscesses. He also has moderate periodontal disease, periodontal bone infection. Now, in terms of his cranium, there's no definite perimortem trauma that's noted on the cranium, with the exception that I think he also has a blow to the mouth, a good possibility that he had a blow to the mouth that caused fracturing of this anterior maxillary alveolus. When we look at the right side of the head, we see Dr. Morton's label, and with that label, he has clear evidence of antemortem trauma. He has 3 perforations, one right here that measures about 6.5 millimeters across in diameter. They're beveled margins, one right here, and a depression right here. So there are 3 different defects. When we would analyze something like this, one of the things that we would do is, and courtesy of the Penn Museum, is we would look at their radiographic images. Now, they have CT images of this cranium, and that's in part what's used in doing the stereolithographic reproductions for the facial reconstruction that's in progress. But one of the things that down the road is we need to get good plain film x-rays to just look for the presence of embedded metallic particles that could be associated with that. Dr. Morton's impression was that these were healed impressions and perforations caused by shot, and I think this is a very valid interpretation. They represent relatively low impact damage, as could have been caused by buckshot or as fired from a shotgun or some type of buck and ball load, but they struck in a cluster of which there were at least 3 pellets, and the lack of penetration suggests low velocity, and probably that may be in part due to the distance from the firing weapon. And these fractures have remodeled. This man survived this. So this, again, does not go back to the Alamo. It goes to an incident much earlier than that. These are not young men that this was their first time in battle. Show you some close-ups of these beveled wounds. And one of the things that we do, and we won't go into that, but there are different types of studies that can be done, and we are always making note of different types of genetic anomalies, other kinds of anomalies. One of the things that he has is a very rare trait, very rare genetic trait called the paracondyloid process. It measures about 14 millimeters in length by in terms of its projection, and it actually would have caused some limitations in his mobility to move his head because it was striking against the first cervical vertebra. This individual here is number 556. 556 is a man that is about 30 to 34 years of age. He has a little bit of desiccated tissue that is adhering to this cranium, including also, and it bears back to the one earlier reference, he has some loose brain tissue that is still present inside the cranial vault. He has very complicated suture patterns and the types of features that when we look at his cranium, it's very different from the very first one I started. The wider facial width, the shape of the orbits, the flaring of the zygomatics, all of these other individuals are showing a mixed ancestry that would include some Native American and some European ancestry. His teeth, no trauma to the midface, but the postmortem loss that we've talked about in terms of the teeth. Lateral view. Right lateral view. One of the things that we can do is we can identify in a cranium, as with other bones, we can determine the sex of the individual. This is a classic feature of a male characteristic when you're looking at the back of the skull. This is the nuchal ridge area, the external occipital protuberance that you're seeing right here. It's where all of the neck muscles come in and hold your head back. And the very well-developed musculature that you see right here is classic male feature. There are 2 individuals in this series that, because it's a very early collection, sometimes there can be these India ink labels can fade, make it hard to read, and there are 2 other individuals when we went up there that we needed to look at to make sure that they were in or out of this collection, and we took them out. You can use different alternate light sources and things like that to read faded labels, and from that, both of those individuals were females, and so one of the things that we would do is we would pick that up initially. Not that you couldn't have a female there, but by looking at the taphonomy, the preservation, those features, we would remove them from the collection. The one that is listed in Dr. Morton's collection, one of the things it talks about is a deformity to the cranial vault, and that's an intentional type of cranial deformation, a cradle boarding in a female, but the preservation coming from a burial site, totally different preservation, totally different craniofacial morphology. By going through this series, the 8 that were possible suspects, we definitely can remove 2, and I'm showing you the pictures of the 6 that belong. This is the individual that Amanda Danning is doing a reconstruction of. He is another battle-hardened soldier in the sense that he has sustained a crushing blow from a single impact to the mid-face. And it is approximately 60 millimeters from here, mid-orbit to mid-orbit across this way here, down to, you can see a crease midway through the nose. These are called the frontal processes of the maxilla. So this area right here was severely impacted by a blow that is healed, but would have caused, as she does this reconstruction, you're going to see that the face is scooped out in this area, and it fractured both of the nasals. You're seeing both nasal bones approximately half there. They never healed again, and so in the decomposition process, these crushed in nasals would have fallen off easily just with decomposition. So a very serious blow. It would have distorted this left eye orbit, and it's a well-healed impact blow to the side of the to the nose, deforming what the nose would have looked like, pushing the nose in, pushing the nose over, deforming the ethmoid bones inside. Would have knocked the stuffing out of him when it happened. This is number 557. 557 is the cranium of a male aged 30 to 34 years of age. Features on him that are very distinctive. He has some severe dental pathology, as you see in this carious lesion right here, a number of teeth that are missing, right lateral view, left lateral view, focusing in on an exit wound in the superior left parietal of the cranium. As we look at the base of the skull, this individual has a gunshot wound that is present in the left, we would say the left nuchal region of the occipital bone, and the projectile entered posteriorly and slightly superior. So we're looking right here. This is the left side of the cranium, so it's very deep. This is the foramen magnum where the spinal cord goes through. It's very deep in the neck musculature. It's coming through the neck and is going to travel superiorly and anteriorly, exiting out right at the coronal suture that you see here in the anterior left parietal. The entrance wound is very circular. This is not a deformed bullet. One of the things I asked and received a great deal of very helpful assistance in interpreting this from some of your weapons experts. And one of the things that we've discussed is the fact that this circular perforation, it's not, we considered, could it be a ricochet? That is not a deformed bullet. It is 9 millimeters across. The bullet making that penetration is low velocity. It's fairly close range, but it's got enough force that it's a through and through, goes completely through the cranium, and it produces fairly fine radiating fractures. There are 3 small, you can't maybe see them so easily, but 3 fine radiating fractures that emanate from that, hairline cracks that emanate from that opening. The actual projectile itself traveled upward and anteriorly and exited through the left superior parietal at coronal suture, and it has the external beveling that is classic in a gunshot wound. This is going to be produced by a projectile that is a very small bullet, and this is part of the discussion that they helped me with. We talked about the types of loads that could cause this because it's an unusual position. I've seen it many times before, but it's an unusual position where this individual is either going to be higher than the person that's shooting up and catching him in the base of the neck and traveling up, or he's going to be down, kneeling, or down on the ground when he sustained this wound. And some of the things that they talked about is the fact that there were, for example, small caliber Kentucky rifles or non-military type firearms that were carried by volunteers as, say, personal sidearms. And it's going to be a projectile. The bullet itself is going to be about 8 millimeters in its diameter. And there are things like a buck and ball load, shotgun, but it's the location of this that makes me think, and what we talked about is the dispersion of these different projectiles, but it's the location of this that makes me think this is at fairly close range, and I don't mean at the back of his head, but at fairly close range to this individual. And here you're seeing then the pathway of this particular bullet. Another thing that this individual had sustained earlier is he has been in an altercation that led to a bladed weapon injury to his face. And what you're seeing is a slice. This is the right lateral. Here's his right orbit here, his nasal bones, and you're seeing a right lateral strike that comes in, cuts into the nasal bones, right in front of the forehead, cuts into the nasals, goes down about 2.5 millimeters. It is a cut, an edge cut that extends all the way across in front of the right lower frontal orbit, and it is approximately about 50 millimeters in length in terms of that slice. So in terms of thinking about reconstructions, for instance, if you were to do a reconstruction of this individual, one of the things that you'd have is a well-healed, this is well before the battle or any of the battles that you're dealing with in terms of Texas independence, but he would have a well-healed long gash across his face, his mid-face. Number 558 is a male that is 27 to 34 years of age. And when we look at his features, he, like the other 5, have Native American and European admixture features. All of his maxillary teeth were lost post-mortem. You see in the teeth that are, the sockets that are present, that he had no abscesses. And he has a large projectile entrance, a gunshot wound, to the sphenoid lower frontal. This is the left lower frontal and sphenoid region. And this particular fracture, it's a roughly circular opening. It has a top to bottom superior inferior measurement of approximately 23 millimeters and an approximate width of 17 millimeters from front to back, from anterior to posterior. And when you look at different angles, so you're seeing it defined right here. When you're looking at it close, it's right here. It is going to cause a blowout avulsion fracturing of the left orbit as it causes this fragment of bone to detach and go into the socket. And now you're seeing that it's a through and through in the sense that the projectile goes in through the entrance and exits out the back of the cranium, leaving a much larger opening in the posterior right vault, right at a landmark that we would define as asterion. The projectile traveled posteriorly from left to right. It's going left to right and down, exiting at asterion, and it causes somewhat irregular fracturing as it exits in the posterior mastoid region. And it also has then, as you look at different sides of the vault, for instance, on the left side from the entrance, it has a primary radiating fracture that goes along the base of the cranium that's about 83 millimeters in length. This large opening that we're seeing here, about 25 millimeters in diameter, has the pronounced external beveling that we would say is a classic exit. And the size of the projectile is consistent with a large caliber ball, but certainly low velocity impact in terms of what I see in terms of today's weapons. So you're seeing the pathway of this particular gunshot projectile. The last individual in this series is number 689. This male is 24 to 28 years of age, and he's represented by a very complete cranium. He is labeled a little bit different in the sense that he is labeled Mexican, and also in printing that maybe you can see there. And the left parietal bones are labeled Mexican skull from the battleground of San Jacinto, and this is the one that is presented to Dr. James Cook by Charles Pearson and presented to Dr. Morton by James Cook. It is through Jeff Dunn's research that we have information as to who these different individuals are. One of the things that you'll see in the cranium, this is looking at most of the teeth being lost, is you'll see small perforations in some of the Morton crania, and that is because they were, in the 1850s, he had them mounted in a way that would lead to small little perforations in the side of the cranium, part of his mounting process. They're small drill holes that are former mounting perforations. The dentition is represented by the first maxillary molars. His third molars, he in terms of his genetic development, does not have those. Here is the inscribed description on the right side of the head. It is from a different collector than Audubon. The posterior portion of the cranium has 2 sharp bladed injuries. These are made by different, as far as I can tell, different weapons, both bladed weapons. One strike was an upward directed oblique impact that cut and removed an oval-shaped slice of the outer table. So when I look at bone, this is outer table, then underneath that is going to be the cancellous bone called the diplo, and then there is the inner table. This slices deeply into this bone, into the bone surface for a depth of approximately 4.5 millimeters, but it did not slice through the inner table. So in theory, it's not really hitting into the brain. And this particular weapon measures about 52 millimeters across this way by 21 millimeters here. It's catching it in an oblique impact, and that's very different from this one right here. The second, it's showing a close-up of this. The second one is a parallel, well, it's perpendicular to the bone, sharp blade impact that cut transversely and deeply into the superior occipital, so it is a straight impact by a large, such as a saber, blade that causes slicing all the way through the bone, actual penetrating the brain cavity with exfoliation, or maybe say avulsion, fracturing the inner table. This cut has a transverse width across the cranium of 83 millimeters, and the width of this, as you measure it, where you look at it, it's leaving an impact width of about 1 millimeter. And then as the blade struck, one of the things that happens is the blade twists, and as it twists, it causes this bone here to then bend, causing uplifting of the superior cut edge. And so it has then also radiating fractures, maybe not seen in this angle, but radiating fractures that course away from the edges of this fracture. Now, I wanted to show you one last thing, if it'll do it. I wanted to show you, when you look at this close, it's amazing to me how the striations, you can actually see the striations in that blade. This is not that saber that did this. This is something else, as far as I can tell. This is more, let's say, hatchet size, maybe even a little bevel. It's a funny type of shape because, you know, I deal with, in my police work, I deal with axes and things like that. Who would think it, but I do fairly regularly. And, you know, this is an unusual shape in the way this gouges into the bone. The existence of this small series is highly significant. It informs us of the lives and deaths of these men, taking us in a more direct and intimate way into a view of a few of the men who served in the Mexican army under General Santa Anna and who died at the Battle of San Jacinto. There's much more that can be learned from them. And I would point out that while we went to examine these per your special interest, working with the Morton collection, we were actually there studying other crania that came from other locations as well. Audubon was featured. Mr. Audubon was also collecting human crania in the upper Missouri region, and he sent back a number of skulls. And I tend to focus a lot on my studies, being from Wyoming, on Plains Indians, and so they added tremendously to our research there. Today, the Morton collection continues to be an important resource for research into human anatomy, paleopathology, and studying secular change and quantitative variation among world populations. The questions and methods certainly have changed dramatically, and they will continue to evolve, contributing toward the resolution of questions that in Dr. Morton's day were not even conceived of. And in the same sense, the questions that I ask from the bones, the way I'm trained to look at bones is so different from the way I was trained some 30 years ago. And so this is a very special collection that I'm privileged to be able to provide a first look at them, but I would assure you that there's much more that can be learned in terms of evaluating the pathology, reconstructions, as far as facial reconstructions, different types of chemical analyses that can tell you much more about who they are as men and what the Texas experience was like in the 1830s. Thank you.
Can you answer a few questions? Sure. And we have a mic here that you can come to. That was utterly fascinating. I think we know now what some people mean when they talk about battle-hardened veterans. And if you're stronger in the broken places, then these were indeed battle-hardened veterans. Dr. Owsley can answer a few questions in the time we have before we take a break and then get set up for Dr. Torgett's presentation. Could we raise the lights just a bit in the room? If you are not scared of the dark, you can make your way to one of the microphones. Yes, sir.
Did you find any information about the Karankawa Indians in your research in Texas?
Did I find any information on
About the Karankawa Indians?
All right. His question is about the Karankawa Indians, and I have worked in a number of museums in in Texas, and have conducted a number of studies on their historic and prehistoric collections. There is a mission that was excavated a number of years ago that was involved. It was the Archaeological Research Laboratory at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And that mission was serving some Karankawa Indians. And Dr. Richard Jantz, I was brought down initially to get it going, and Dr. Richard Jantz and his team did an analysis, and they did a number of examinations of Native American remains from that site, as well as also Hispanic remains from that site. And so there are studies out there and reports out there that deal with the Karankawa. Other questions?
Over here? I can't see. Is there anyone who can raise the light slightly?
I can't, I'm trying, I don't know how to do it.
Okay,
Down, but I couldn't get it back up.
okay.
Don't be shy. One of the things that I'd like, if any of you are up in Washington, D.C., I'd like to call attention is we've been analyzing a whole series of 17th century remains that come from sites like Jamestown and historic St. Mary City. And we've been following this whole process of becoming American. You're following this process of becoming Texan, but of becoming American from Europe and Africa at sites like Jamestown and looking at the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. And the types of studies that we're engaged in are just absolutely fascinating. When we give remains the Cadillac treatment of analyses, for instance, we're testing their isotopes, for instance. We're looking at, and that allows us to derive dietary information. It allows us to figure out where they come from as individuals. I'd like you to come up and see in Washington our exhibition on this study, and it'll tell you a little bit more about what we can learn from bones. It's entitled Written in Bone Forensic Files of the 17th Century Chesapeake, and that exhibit is at the Natural History Museum for the next 3 years. Yes,
Dr.
sir.
Helsley, I'd like to ask you a question,
Yes.
and that is the number of wounds that you found, old wounds, in these soldiers? It seems that you had almost unanimous experience with previous battles among these men with fairly serious head wounds. Is that unusual or usual in the kinds of soldiers from other wars of the 19th century that you've looked at?
Okay, his question is regarding cranial trauma. For one thing, when you're talking about a presentation, if you were going to identify, just say to me, you've got 6 crania, no lower jaw, just crania. Skull is a cranium and mandible, crania only. Are you going to be able to talk for 15 minutes? Well, of course, we can always fill up time. But this series has more trauma than what I'm used to seeing, absolutely, without a doubt. I have analyzed many Civil War soldiers, probably on the order of 200 plus. We document this type of trauma, and I see, for instance, in the Hunley sailors, one of them, for instance, was an early Marine who would actually board ships that are Union ships in his non-Hunley duty, Confederate submarine duty, and he showed facial injuries, fractures. We document all of the types of facial fractures. I'm looking for it, we document it carefully, we don't miss it, and we don't see near the extent of trauma that these men show. Not all of them have what I would say is ante-mortem trauma, but many of them do, and they are very, they obviously, these guys are tough as nails, and they obviously could survive it because they were functioning, but these are major blows. One was the impact with a blade here, the crushing blow to the face. The other is going to be some sort of shotgun blast to the side of the head. That's a higher frequency than what I ever see.
My question goes to a similar point, and that is these are occurring over time. Is there a way that we can tell about how long a period of time we're looking at in the healing of these injuries that you've got?
Okay, question is asking about healing. One of the fabulous collections out there that we've studied is the National Museum of Health and Medicine's Army Medical Museum collection. If you put it in historic perspective, at the time of the Civil War, so you guys are decades earlier, but at the time of the Civil War, the military surgeons and doctors that were working at that time did not have a good handle on how to best treat the men that were wounded in combat. And the Surgeon General, a new position, the Surgeon General sent out orders to his surgeons in the field to send in documented specimens. And these are documented in a way that says this is the cranium of Private so-and-so, he was shot at Antietam, and he survived this many days. And they very carefully document, some better, some worse, but very carefully document the treatment that these men would receive. In the same sense, they were trying to see what kinds of damage, different types of shot, canister shot, I mean, they have everything in there from buck and ball type loads, lots of shotgun type loads, canister shot, that type of thing. And some of these men are where they're just sending the amputation in, or they're sending the cranium in because they want a better study. The surgeons of the time wanted to study and see how to best deal with these. And by looking at the treatment records, they could then rule out certain options as working or not working. That collection is a carefully preserved collection, and it provides a lot of comparative data for my historic studies, including my Civil War research. Well, one of the things about that series, to answer his question, is you will have then the known date that this particular soldier was wounded, how they treated it, and when that soldier died, because they do die to get in that collection, and they preserve that. So you can see injuries, you know, that are the day and you're dead, 2 days, 10 days, all the way up to lasting, surviving for years. And you can see changes as the bone remodels. Bone will remodel. If it doesn't kill you, your bone will try and respond to that. It's very dynamic. At about 10 days, you can look at visible changes where the bone is trying to destroy the damaged bone, the bone that has lost its blood supply and is dying. So you get these little osteoclasts, bone cells, that are destroying that. You can begin to see that lytic destructive process coming into play. You can begin to see by 10 to 14 days, you can see visible new bone called woven bone or subperiosteal bone apposition laying down. Now, this collection, I'm going a little long here, but I'll finish it up. This collection is unbelievable in the sense that with these known dates, one of the things that we've been working with is shot fractures to the pelvis and the femur that incapacitate the man, and the man then is sick to varying degrees, deadly sick to varying degrees, and they document their care, and ultimately they die, and then they will retrieve, for instance, that thigh bone. We have been working with the Washington Hospital Center with a grant that allows us to DEXA scan. Now, most of you that are women that are, say, 45 and 50 years, you're going to be DEXA scanned in your life, and it's looking at bone density. We're DEXA scanning these Civil War soldiers as we are with our colonial soldiers, as we are with a modern reference series, and we're looking at bone density over the last 400 years in North America, and it in part has to do with how healthy our bone is in terms of our activity patterns. But that study with the Civil War soldiers, where you know exactly how long that soldier's been on his back, allows us to monitor the loss of bone density as it occurs from inactivity. And it is a study that is in parallel with your modern day soldiers in places like Iraq that sustain similar types of injuries. So these studies of historic and modern go back and forth. Now, to get back to really is straightforward question is the injuries that these men show do not show, with one exception, any active remodeling. The blow to the face, that is not something that is weeks or months old. That is extremely well healed. That would be, and I'd hate to say how many years, but that's at least a year plus in duration. The one that is the puncture to the side of the head, that is still actively remodeling. That is older, because it is remodeled, that is older than, say, the Alamo. It's not something that occurred there, but it is a puncture because the inner bone surface is not closed off. It is still changing. So most of these injuries are older than anything that you're dealing with in the Texas Revolution. To find out where these blows come from, this shot to the head, that is really remodeled. You've got to take these men back to their service in Mexico or other things that they were engaged in. It's a pretty hard life in terms of the impact.
If we can have a very quick question and answer, we have time for the one more.
I have a question. We know that the Mexican army came from across the republic to arrive into our republic for the war. Is there any way to tell about the regions of origins for these skulls, geographic regions?
There's not a lot. With regard to our colonials, yes, we can do that to some degree. Colonial in my area, in the Chesapeake, we can pick out English and African, we can identify origins coming at it that way. In terms of the Mexicans, there's not a lot of this type of isotope data that has been collected. There is one paper that I've heard that dealt with a little bit of Mexican isotope data, a very little bit from soldiers, Mexican soldiers that were killed at Goliad, and they did a very limited testing. There's not a lot of that kind of isotope study. I don't know if you can yet. The reference series is out there that you could begin to take them back to specific regions in Mexico. You know, everything has kind of its time in the sense that These, as I started out, these skulls, these crania have not been lost, but if you'd asked us to analyze them 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we wouldn't have had the comparative depth to even do the kinds of things that we can now. And so I would say that that's probably a pretty tough challenge to see if you could take them back to specific states in Mexico. But the identifications that we do today, you could not have done 10 years ago. Those crania have been preserved for a reason so that you could ultimately, that's their legacy. You can learn something about men for which there is no written record. So, thank you.
Thank you. We're running a couple of minutes ahead of time. That's good. We'll take a 12-minute break and start promptly at 11:25 with Dr. Andrew Torgett.